All right. All right. We're looking at the parties or the sects of Judaism. Josephus tells us that there were three parties in Judaism in his day. He says, moreover, when I was a child and about 14 years of age, I was commended by all for the love I had to learning, on which account the high priests and principal men of the city came then frequently to me together in order to know my opinion, excuse me, about the accurate understanding of points of the law. So uh, Josephus is not humble. You know, when I was 14 years old, all the leaders of Judaism came to me to get my opinion about the law. And when I was about 16 years old, I had a mind to make trial of the several sects that were among us. These sects are three. The first is that of the Pharisees, the second, that of the Sadducees, and the third, that of the Essenes, as we have frequently told you. For I thought that by this means I might choose the best. So he wants to decide which of these sects he should join. He mentions three here, and in another writing, he also mentions a fourth party called the Zealots. Let's first of all say that most of the people, the Jewish people in this day, did not belong to any of these parties. Most belong to the masses, or what are called the Am Haaretz, the people of the land. Many of them respected the Pharisees, but were not actually Pharisees. These people were looked down upon by those who occupied the places of respect as members of the various parties. And Jesus was looked down on because he welcomed these humble and poor people, the people of the land. Let us look at these parties one after the other. First of all, the Pharisees. When we talked about the Hasmonean rulers, we mentioned a group called the Hasidians, meaning the pious ones. They were zealous for keeping the law of Moses. They resisted the corrupt priests who ruled the nation without a great commitment to being pious before God. Most scholars agree that the Pharisees go back to the Hasidians. Okay, that's where their roots are. It's generally believed that the word Pharisee means separated one. And Josephus describes them this way. These are a certain sect of the Jews that appear more religious than others and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. The law was certainly at the heart of Pharisaical religion. But the Pharisees were the religious liberals of Jesus' day. They believed not only the Old Testament, but also interpretations of the Old Testament, which applied to everyday life. This body of interpretation was called the tradition of the elders, and it was just as binding upon them as the Torah itself. They attempted to apply all the laws, including the ones for the priests, to everyone. So that made it much more difficult to keep the law. If you have to keep not only the law for you, but also the law for the priest, which was a higher standard. So they kept not only the law, but also this body of tradition. And let me see if I can illustrate it. Wrong thing. Let's say that this is the law. This circle is the law. And you want to make sure that you don't violate the law. You don't do that which would put you in violation. And you want to be careful because you want to be a good Jew. You want to make sure that you don't break any of the laws. So this is what the Pharisees did. Again, this is the law, and they did what they called make a fence around the law. This is the tradition of the elders. The outer circle is the tradition of the elders, the inner circle is the law. And if you make sure that you don't keep or you don't break the tradition, then you'll make sure that you don't break the law. For example, if the law says don't walk more than 1 kilometer on the Sabbath, the tradition of the elders would say don't walk half a mile on the Sabbath. That way, if you don't walk half a mile, you'll make sure that you don't walk a mile. Okay? So what this did was it made the keeping of the law much more difficult. And so the law, as we are told at times in the New Testament, became a burden. Not just the law itself, but also the tradition. This insistence on keeping the tradition of the elders made for a separation between the Jews. For example, the Pharisee could not eat in a house that did not prepare food in a prescribed way or serve food that had been not been tithed on. So they found themselves able to socialize only with a select group of people, people like themselves. Those outside their group were the people of the land. The Pharisees were a renewal movement, preparing the Jewish people for God's eschatological intervention. They would purify the people through a strict keeping of the law. And when Israel became sufficiently pure, then God would intervene and usher in the age to come. Now, the New Testament also mentions scribes, associating them with the Pharisees. The scribes were the experts at the law, the Torah. Like a lawyer today would be an expert in the secular law. Not all scribes were Pharisees, but they were influenced by the interpretation of the Pharisees. Bruce Metzger gives 4 beliefs of the Pharisees. The first is foreordination. That is that God has planned what is going to happen. He has already planned it out, and his will be done. Secondly, immortality and resurrection. They believed that people had immortal souls and that one day at the end of time, there would be a resurrection from the dead for the people of God. Angels and demons. The Pharisees had a highly developed angelology and demonology. And the Pharisees recognized as the supreme authority in religion the Hebrew scriptures and the oral traditions. Metzger describes the Pharisees this way. As in other religious movements, the proportion of sincere, earnest adherents came to be outnumbered by those who were characterized by less worthy motives. Even the Jewish Talmud itself acknowledges the existence of several kinds of Pharisees, not all of whom were good and upright. It differentiates 7 varieties and vividly characterizes 5 of them with descriptive adjectives that hold him up for ridicule. Now, listen to these descriptions of different kinds of Pharisees. A, the wait a little Pharisees always had an excuse for putting off doing a good deed. The bruised or bleeding Pharisee, in order to avoid looking at a woman, shuts his eyes and stumbles against a wall so as to bruise himself and bleed. Now, can you imagine? Here's a Pharisee. He doesn't want to see a woman and lust. And so he closes his eyes and he walks around and he bumps into things and bruises himself, bleeds. Yeah, he really didn't want to see a woman. C, the shoulder Pharisees wears, as it were, his good deeds ostentatiously upon his shoulder where all can see them. He wants everybody to see his good deeds. D, the humpbacked Pharisee walks about stooped over in mock humility. E, the ever-reckoning Pharisee, continually counting up his good deeds to balance them against his bad deeds. So, okay, let's see, how many good deeds have I done? And I did some bad things here, but maybe I've done enough to counterbalance the bad deeds. Okay? F, the God-fearing Pharisee stands in awe and dread of God. And G, God-loving or born Pharisee is a true son of Abraham and a genuine Pharisee. Now, this is the Jews themselves describing the Pharisees. Jesus gave the Pharisees scathing rebukes. Remember, there in Matthew, how he calls them hypocrites. And the Pharisees were prominent in planning Jesus' death. Any questions or comments about the Pharisees? All right, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the party of the wealthy. They were particularly associated with the priesthood in Jerusalem. It seems that they got their name from Zadok, the high priest under David and Solomon. Remember when we talked about the Hasmonean rulers? The priests were of the tribe or the family of Zadok until we get down to Antiochus Epiphanes, who just makes a high priest the one that gives him the highest bribe. Okay, so they were from the family of Zadok. Religiously, they were conservative. Josephus says that they did not adhere to the tradition of the elders. You know, for them, no offense around the law. Or they did not believe what was not taught explicitly in the Old Testament. So they did not believe in the resurrection of the body or the existence of angels or demons. So they were associated with the priests, the high priests. Most of the priests, however, were not of the high priest family. They were more humble, and they lived throughout Palestine, not just in Jerusalem. Okay? The center of the Pharisees' power was the temple. And when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the Pharisees disappeared. We have no Sadducee document telling what they believed, so we have to rely on what other people said about them to know what they believed. Okay, that's the Sadducees, the party of the wealthy. Now, the Pharisees really had a following among the masses, the poor people. The Sadducees did not. The Sadducees were the wealthy ones. They were the ones that had the power, and they were the ones that got rich off the people. All right, the Essenes. The Essenes are not mentioned in the Bible, but they are referred to by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. There were about 4,000 Essenes in Palestine in the first century. If the Pharisees were the separated ones, the Essenes were the really separated ones.
Sir, excuse.
Yes.
Sir.
Yes, Alvin.
Your mic is kind of robotic for all of us. The sound, I don't know why.
Okay.
We don't know why. So we're hearing static.
Okay. Let me.
We don't know why.
Let me put on some other headphones here. Hold on a second.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. No sound, sir.
No sound.
There's sound, but it's like low volume.
Okay. Is that any better? Can you hear me all right?
It's clear now,
Thumbs
sir.
up?
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, sir, it's better.
All right. Thank you.
But the sound is low.
The sound
For
is
me.
low. Okay.
Yeah.
There looks like a volume adjustment here.
The volume is low now.
Hold on just a minute. Okay, can you hear me? Is the volume still low?
I can hear you, that's fine.
All right, okay. Let's try that.
Yeah. I can hear but low. Anyway, it's okay.
Okay, well,
It's
try
okay.
to turn your sound up as far as it'll go so that you can hear me better.
Yeah.
And we'll have to try to figure out what's going on.
Yes. But there will there be a record? How can we connect the recording, sir? I can't find the link to the recordings.
I will give it to you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. Okay, like the Pharisees, they had their roots in the Hasidim or the Hasidians. They denounced the temple and its practices as being corrupt. They withdrew into their own communities to keep themselves pure, and this was symbolized by wearing of white robes. The community at Qumran, from which we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, was such a community. There were Essenes in other places. There were Essenes who lived in Jerusalem as well. They were devoted to a simple and strict lifestyle. They were known for prayer, the study of scripture, and baptisms and washings. There was a probation period after which a person that could become part of the community. They practiced asceticism, that is, giving up pleasures for spiritual reasons. And they were very legalistic. In fact, they were so legalistic that in their community, you couldn't go to the bathroom on Sunday because that would involve digging a hole, and that would be work. I shouldn't say Sunday, I should say the Sabbath. That would be work, and so that was forbidden. Now that's getting pretty legalistic. They had many purification rituals, washings, and they also stayed in a readiness for holy war. They believed in two messiahs, one priestly and one kingly. Now, John the Baptist seems to be an ascetic. He also lived in the area of the Judean wilderness, and some people have speculated that John the Baptist was an Essene. Okay, before our break, let's just briefly look at the Zealots, and that will finish our treatment of the Jewish background. You know, the term zeal in the Bible is a political as well as a religious term. The concept of zeal goes all the way back to the Old Testament, to people like Phineas and Jehu, who physically attacked the enemies of God. Josephus calls the Zealots the fourth philosophy. Now, you know, it's really interesting to look at the term zeal in both the New Testament and the Old Testament, and you will find that it is usually associated with violence. Violence. Even when Paul says that he was zealous for the law, he tells about how he persecuted the church. The zealots were violent. They believed in armed revolt, and they were called the Sicarii, the dagger people or assassins. Theologically, they were close to the Pharisees. In the first century, the Zealots advocated and worked for revolt against Rome. An example of a zealot would be Judas of Galilee. In AD 6, he staged a revolt against Rome. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot. So the zealots were active in the war against Rome in AD 66 to 70. The last remnant of them, as we looked at before, were on Masada. And the Romans finally took them in around AD 74. And they also, at that time, destroyed Qumran. And we have no evidence of the Zealots after that. They seem to have been more or less like the Sadducees, wiped off the map. Okay, do you have any questions or comments here?
So there's a Simon the Zealot mentioned by Luke. Does it relate to any of it?
I think so. I think so. I think he was probably a political radical. Yeah, and you sort of wonder how he got along with Matthew, you know, who worked for the Romans.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So just to comment,
Yes.
learning about these four sects really puts a good perspective when we read the Gospels. It gives us more idea of who Jesus was talking to and
That's
all these
right.
characters.
That's right. You know, yeah, the Sadducees come and say to Jesus, there was a woman who had seven husbands and they all died. Who's going to be your husband in the resurrection? Well, the Sadducees don't even believe in the resurrection.
That's right.
It's just a attempt to trip Jesus up, you know, to find something to accuse him of. Right. So hopefully all of this that we've looked at here in the Jewish background is going to help us understand Jesus better, the context of his teaching, his disciples, and all that we see there in the Gospels. Any other questions?
These
Sir,
four,
was
Esther,
Caiaphas, was Caiaphas a Pharisee or a Sadducee?
he was a Sadducee.
Okay, sir.
He
Thank you.
he was the high priest. Yeah. The man
Question,
with
please.
power. Yes, Elise?
Okay.
those four sects, are they all agreed in the law? Are they all, you know, nothing against each other in regards of the law?
They all accepted the law. The Sadducees accepted less than the others. In fact, there are those who say the Sadducees only accepted the Pentateuch, the 5 first books of the Old Testament. I don't really know that that's true. But the Sadducees did not accept other teachings like the resurrection, like angels and demons. So they were very religiously conservative.
You,
Okay. All right. All right. Let's take a 10-minute break here, and then we will come back and we'll look at the Greco-Roman background. Have a good break. Okay.
Just okay.
Now we are. Thank you, Alvin. And you know, in answer to that question, Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Not only did they use Roman coins in Palestine at that time, they also used Greek coins. The Roman coin was the denarius and the Greek coin was the drachma, but they were valued about the same. The temple tax was the half shekel from Tyre. And similar to Cambodia today. In Cambodia, they use the American dollar for almost all of their transactions. The very small ones, they use their own Cambodian currency. But for most things, it's the American dollar that they use. The provinces of the Roman Empire were of two kinds. There were senatorial and imperial. The senatorial provinces were those that had long been part of the empire and in which there was tranquility and loyalty to the emperor. They were under the authority of a proconsul, under the Senate. So the Senate was in charge of them and a proconsul or governor ruled them. So those are the senatorial provinces. The imperial provinces were under the authority of the emperor. These were ones that were more on the fringes, the outer parts of the empire, places where insurrection could rise more easily. And they were under the direct leadership of the emperor. They were overseen by a prefect or a procurator. Judea was an imperial province. The prefects that we know about in scripture are Pontius Pilate, Felix, and Festus. If we go to, say, Achaia, where Corinth was, that was a senatorial province. It was under the proconsul Gallio.
Sir,
Yes.
was that a concession between the emperor and the Senate to divide the empire into senatorial provinces and imperial provinces?
You know, I don't know if it was a concession. It was probably just a part of the reality that the emperor has to have more direct control where there is a possibility of insurrection. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Mhm. Greco-Roman society, stratification. In pagan society, social strata was clearly defined. There were the aristocrats, a very small middle class, a large number of poor people called plebs or plebeians, and the largest group of all were slaves. The aristocracy was made up primarily of wealthy landowners and those in political power. The middle class at this time was very small. It had been mostly replaced with the poor. Many of the plebs or plebeians were worse off than slaves. At least the slaves were fed and housed, whereas sometimes the free poor were destitute. Slavery was a widespread institution in the Roman world. Estimates of slavery run from anywhere from 1/5 to 1/2 of the population. Slaves were considered chattel, merely animate machines like any other work animal. They had very few rights under the law. They were allowed common law marriages, but the children were the property of the owner. Slaves were permitted to join guilds or associations to meet their social or religious needs. And in those guilds, they were on the same level as freemen. There were some outright benefits of being a slave. One was that they couldn't draft you into the army. The other was that you didn't have to pay taxes. Now, where did slaves come from? First of all, from birth. If slaves gave birth, their children were slaves also. Taking abandoned children, this exposure that we talked about before, putting unwanted children in a public place to be picked up, either to be made slaves or prostitutes. There was a sale of one's own children. If a person was in debt, they could sell their children to pay off their debt, or they could sell themselves if they had to. Criminals were often made slaves. Some people were kidnapped and made slaves that way. Also, prisoners of war were made slaves. Slaves got their freedom through a process known as manumission. This could be done in different ways, but the way that has most relevance for us in the New Testament was a method known as sacral manumission. I think we mentioned this the other day. If a slave over time could save his money, he could possibly buy his freedom. If he was able to save the money, he would deposit the money in the temple of some god. Okay, this is sacral manumission. His master would then go through the sacred rigmarole of selling him to the god. Technically, the man was a slave of the god, but in people's eyes, he was a free man. So he would go to the temple, once a year, twice a year to do some cleanup or something to show that he belonged to the god. Here is an inscription from around 200 to 199 BC, found on the wall of the temple of Apollo in Delphi. Delphi was another city in Greece. It said, the Pythian Apollo bought from Ctesibius of Amphissa. So the Pythian Apollo is the god. He bought from Ctesibius a female slave whose name is Nicaea, by race a Roman, at a price of 3 silver minas and half a mina. Former seller according to the law of Eumnastus of Amphissa. He has received the price. The deed of sale Nicaea has entrusted to Apollo for freedom. Now, I think we mentioned this the other day. What does this idea of buying someone's freedom in the New Testament, what does that bring to mind?
The coming of Christ.
Christ. Yeah.
Buy us from sin.
Okay, Christ buying us from sin. Okay, and what do we call that?
Is it
Redemption.
propitiation?
Is it
Okay.
redemption?
Redemption.
It is redemption.
Yeah.
Redemption.
Redemption.
The price that is paid is the ransom.
Yeah.
And so the ransom is paid to set the slave free. Now, spiritually, we were slaves of sin, slaves of Satan. But Jesus Christ paid the price for our redemption. Peter says that we were bought by the precious blood of Christ. So through his death, we have been set free. We have been given our freedom. Now, the price was the blood of Christ, but that price was not given to anybody. the devil wasn't paid anything for our freedom. So there the analogy breaks down.
Yes.
But it's a beautiful thing, a beautiful illustration of what God has done for us through the redemption that is through Christ.
Sir,
Yes,
I agree. But this inscription also tells us that the analogy of we were formerly slaves of sin and Satan, just like Nicaea. Then
Mhm.
we were bought by the blood of Christ, and then we became slaves of Christ.
That's
Just
right.
like the girl now belongs to Apollo, and so now we belong to Christ.
That's
It's
right.
also a good analogy.
That's right. So we are slaves to God. We serve
Hi, sir.
God.
Hi.
We're getting
Hi,
some
sir.
noise. All right. I don't know what the noise was, but
It's my dog, sir.
oh, okay, okay.
Can I say something, sir?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
just wanted
Emil.
to understand better the perspective why the slave has to go through a god, a Roman god, instead of doing it directly and negotiate with the owner. I think, is it the same as what we have right now, that we cannot be freed from sin, that we have to go, I mean, we need Christ to have that salvation. Is that
Okay.
something like during that time, that they cannot go direct to the owner?
They could go direct to the owner, and many did. That is the process called manumission. It's the purchasing of the freedom, and so they could do that directly with the owner. But there was a special kind of purchase called sacral manumission, where they did it through the god. So the sacral manumission has more relevance to us because it so closely lines up with what Christ did for us. And, you know, I would imagine that if Paul is preaching to a group of pagans and he mentions redemption, what are they going to think of? They're going to think of sacral manumission. And it's going to be an appropriate way of teaching them what Jesus Christ does for us. Just as through sacral manumission, the slave is made free, so through spiritually, Jesus Christ sets us free by the purchase price that he gave. Okay?
Yeah, sir,
Yes, Rebecca?
what I see here in the example is that he was bought, the slave is bought from Eusebius by Apollo. Apollo is a god.
That's right.
It's little g. Now what
That's
I'm
right.
seeing there is that now the slave becomes free. But how about us, the analogy to our situation right now is that we are also before slaves to sin and Satan, and then we become slaves to Jesus. Now Apollo is a god, a little g, but Jesus is a capital G. I mean, when the Apostle
Mhm.
Paul said that he becomes a slave to Jesus with his redemption when he got saved.
That's
So
right.
that's when I think more than once he mentioned that in the apostles. Apostle Paul mentioned that in some of his epistles, that he was now a slave to Christ.
That's right.
So Christ, a small, big G, capital G, but Apollo is just a small G.
All right. Yes, that is
I
true.
just think about it now.
Yeah. Now, in the first century, the church did not take an overt stand against slavery. You know, they didn't say, we've got to get rid of slavery because this is wrong. Now, it was wrong, and they knew it was wrong, but they did not form a movement to get rid of it. What they did, rather, was sow the seeds that in time got rid of slavery. a person in the first century would not even be able to imagine society without slavery. You know, it would be like somebody today saying, you've got to get rid of electricity. Oh, what do you mean? Get rid of electricity? We can't do that. That's the way they would respond in the first century when you said get rid of slavery. The whole society depended upon it. But if you look at like the book of Philemon, where the slave owner is asked to receive his slave back, not as merely a slave, but now as a beloved brother in Christ. You see, everyone is made in God's image. And when the Christians came to power, they did away with slavery. So, yes,
I was thinking about what you're saying about Paul and Philemon. The disciples did not destroy or rally against slavery, but in a way, Christianity has a way of, it has benefits like Philemon coming back, the slave coming back to his master, but now it's different. They're brothers. So within the structure, what Jesus did and what Christianity did was to make it better or make it good. Now they're brothers. Yes, they're master and slave, but now they're brothers. So within the structure, it was not destroyed, but Christianity has a way of, I don't know if the right word is making it good or making it better for both the master and the slave.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Okay. Yeah, that is good.
Yes. So I think there's epistles, if I'm not mistaken, in the book of Colossians, wherein there's a guidance there or instruction or advice how we treat the relationships between the master and the one who is I think the
slaves.
Colossians were there. Yeah, how to treat your master and how to treat those who are serving you, something like that, sir. I can't remember the exact chapter and verse, but there's something like that. So I think that is a biblical reference to what Alvin is saying about as if the reconstruction of the relationships between the master and the slave in the Christian point.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
just remembering the references.
Right. So we need to look at this in the context of its in its first century context. And we can, from the 21st century, say, well, this is what they should have done. I think they knew a lot better what they should have done than we can from our perspective. And if the Christian movement had come out violently opposing slavery, it would have been wiped out by the Romans. I mean, the Christians would have been crucified, and it wouldn't have been helpful. But what they did was they sowed the seeds that in time ended slavery. Yeah. Okay. In terms of the stratification of the society, Bruce Longenecker has divided it down into 7 levels. And let's just look at these levels. ES1 are the imperial elites, imperial dynasty, Roman senatorial families, local royalty. These are the really rich people. Under that, ES2, regional or provincial elites, equestrian families, provincial officials, some freed persons. Under that, at ES3, we have municipal elites, wealthy men and women who do not hold office, some freed persons. Now, all 3 of those make up 3% of the population. All 3 of those categories. If we go down to S4, there is a moderate surplus. Some merchants, some traders, some freed persons, some artisans, making up 15% of the population. ES5 is stable near subsistence level. Many merchants and traders, regular wage earners, and artisans, 27%. ES6 at subsistence level, small farm families, laborers, artisans, wage earners, most merchants, 30%. And then at ES7, below subsistence level, some farm families, unattached widows, orphans, beggars, disabled, 25%. So there's a whole range of levels here, and the church did probably not have any from ES1, 2, or 3. Maybe some from the other ones. Longenecker says that Erastus, Gaius, and Phoebe were probably from the ES4 status. He says that Stephanus, Philemon, and Crispus were probably from either ES4 or ES5. He says that Aquila and Priscilla were probably in ES5 or ES6 level. So while there were people in the early church from most of these levels, most of the people in the early church were from level ES5. Most were not from the absolutely lowest level. Now, there were some slaves who would be there in ES7, but Christianity was not just among the very poor. There were some, not many, but there were some from those higher levels as well. Okay, do you have questions or comments here?
What do you say, sir, in regards of historically background of the New Testament? I think it suits Gentiles well in that history, in regards of the Roman Empire and those people, because they are not Jews.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm not sure what your point is, Elise.
My point is, when we talk about the history of the New Testament, and no wonder why those scholars, mention that we have to describe the New Testament in history, especially the Greco-Roman, because the way I look at it, it's more like involving in the history of Gentiles people.
Okay. Yeah, and it's important that we understand this. Let us look at something that is important called patronage. We need to be aware of this. This is what Jesus is talking about in Luke 22:25. The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. In the first century, very few people were wealthy, and many needed financial assistance. The wealthy person was called the patron, and the poorer person was called the client. The patron would give the client money or grain or land, and the client would in turn make known the generosity of the patron and enhance his reputation. Okay, so a rich person gives money to the poor person tells everybody how wonderful the rich person is. So there was an exchange, material help for the client in exchange for praise and honor for the patron. The client then owed his loyalty to the patron. In fact, the worst offense one could commit was to be ungrateful toward and disloyal to one's patron. So this was a long-term relationship that was established. This was not simply charity. The patron was buying a very precious commodity, honor. The Apostle Paul refused to take support from some of the churches. The church in Corinth, he did not take any support from. The same in Thessalonica. Why was that? Well, I think part of it may have to do with patronage. He did not want to be obligated to anyone in a patron-client relationship. He didn't want people to give him money and then they say, but you owe me, you know? You need to tell people how good I am. So he refused to receive anything from the church in Corinth. I think he probably knew those people well and knew what could happen if he took money. Although he had every right to take money. He tells us that clearly in 1 Corinthians 9, but he refused to do it. I think he wanted to avoid this patron-client kind of relationship.
Sir, I agree. That would be a good reason why Paul didn't want to take money from the churches, but rather make money by making tents on his own.
That's right.
Because if you're in Corinth or Ephesus and there are rich people who are Christians but could be patrons, and probably their perspective on money would be still in the patron-client relationship, and so Paul would not want to be under their debt.
That's right.
As to undermine his ministry and apostolic ministry.
I think that's exactly
That's great.
Exactly right, Alvin. That's right. So
Yes, sir, I agree with that because I found that in my where I am, if you receive support from a certain church, you have to abide by their faith practices. For
okay.
example, if you're a Pentecostal and you act like a Pentecostal from a non-denominational church who's supporting you, they
Uh-huh.
would tell you literally to stop doing it. They would not
Yeah.
allow you to be Pentecostal in their church if you want their support.
Yeah.
So
So
I
what do
just-
you do? Do you obey God or go for money? You know?
yeah, I'll just obey God, I guess. Just obey. I mean, not disobey.
Right. You know, what do you do when somebody influential in your church offers to buy you a brand new luxury vehicle, brand new, very expensive car? Well, are you going to be obligated to that person? Are you
I
going to
would think
feel,
so.
yeah, are you going to feel like you owe him something?
I
Like,
would.
like you better
Yeah.
not step on their spiritual toes. You better not talk about their sins. Yeah, it's a tricky thing there that
I think so, sir. Although there are experiences that I've heard of pastors that they were really blessed by their rich members in good faith, but there's a thin line probably that divides between the motive of that person and negative and positive motives. So it's really tricky, as you said,
that's
for
right.
pastors.
That's right. All right. Let us go on to something that I think is very relevant, probably to all of you, more than to me. And that is the concept of honor and shame. The Roman Empire of the first century was an honor and shame-based society. Honor came from being affirmed by one's peers. Okay? I've read that there was no such thing as self-esteem in the first century. Your esteem came from what other people thought of you, not from yourself. So in this sense, from what I understand, it's much more like Asian cultures than Western cultures. Now, there is the concept of honor and shame in American culture, especially if you're a teenager. You don't want to do anything that's going to keep you or going to bring shame among your peer group. But it is not extremely important for most people. A lot of Americans, as long as they have a money in the bank, they don't really care what people think. And but from what I understand, the worst thing that you can do in some Asian societies is to embarrass someone publicly. And that was was very true of the first century Roman Empire. Wright and Bird say a significant feature in the Gospels is that Jesus challenges the authority of the Pharisees, scribes, chief priests, and Herodians to speak for God. In each confrontation with such people, Jesus outperforms them in wisdom and ability, and so increases his own honor while shaming his opponents. This is why we are told that the Pharisees, chief priests, scribes, and Herodians plotted to kill him. That is what people do as the honorable course if they have been shamed by a social inferior. So that's what Wright and Bird say about this in terms of why the Jewish leaders were so insistent on killing Jesus. There was great pressure to conform to the values of the society that a person found himself in. Now we're thinking in terms of mainly here Greco-Roman society. This is important in terms of Christians not following the morals of the pagan society. They were nonconformists. It took great courage to withstand the pressure to conform to the values of the culture rather than the values of the kingdom of God. The cross, of course, was something of shame. It was something that the entire Greco-Roman society looked down upon. You couldn't even mention the cross in polite society. And yet for the Christians, because of what Christ did there, it became a matter of honor and not of shame. Okay, my alarm just went off, so we will have to stop here. Let me just say to you, we had a lot of confusion about the quiz. I think finally everybody got on. Some of you were not able to do too much of it. So we'll decide what to do, okay? But I don't want you to worry about it. All right? Everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So don't lose any sleep.
Yes, sir.
Don't lose any sleep over it.
I almost did, sir.
Thank you.
Because I read for 2 days.
Okay. We'll figure out what to do. Okay. Let
It
me
was
just.
stressful, but that's okay. It's over now.
All right.
I passed.
Let me just ask, do you have any questions or comments before we stop? All right. Okay. Let's see. This is Friday morning, isn't it, in the Philippines? So you all have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next Wednesday morning. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. God bless you.
God bless
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you,
Classmates.
Lord.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
good weekend,
Bye.
everybody.
Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Yes, sir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.